The stars had never seemed so beautiful as they did from Thessaly Station. And Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the great observation window, watching them dance in the eternal darkness of space. She had spent 15 years of her life on this station. And in all that time, she had never grown tired of the view that stretched before her like an endless canvas painted by the universe itself. Thessaly Station was not just any outpost floating in the void between worlds, for it was humanity's greatest achievement in the 600 years since they had first reached beyond their small blue planet and touched the stars here in this massive structure that could hold 3 million souls. Humanity had built something that made other species travel across the galaxy just to witness it with their own eyes. The station was a museum, and a concert hall, and a library, and a garden, all wrapped into one magnificent creation that orbited a neutral world where no species held power over another. 12 different alien civilizations had contributed their finest works to this place, and the collection had grown so vast that a person could spend their entire lifetime walking its corridors and never see everything it held. Elena smiled as she turned away from the window and began her morning walk through the cultural quarter where the Festival of Civilizations would begin in just 3 days. The festival happened once every 5 years, and species from across the known galaxy would send their artists and musicians and philosophers to share in the celebration of all that sentient beings had created. Humanity had become known throughout the stars not as warriors or conquerors, but as the keepers of beauty, and Earth itself was called the Gallery by those who had visited its ancient cities and walked through its countless museums. 300 years had passed since humanity had fought its last war, and the weapons that had once threatened to destroy their world had been locked away in vaults that no one living remembered how to open. They had chosen a different path, a path of creation instead of destruction, and the universe had welcomed them for it. As Elena walked through the gardens that gave the station its name, she noticed that her assistant Marcus was running toward her with a look on his face that told her something unexpected had happened. "Ambassador," he called out as he reached her side and tried to catch his breath. "We have received a message from the Keth Dominion, and they wish to send a delegation to the festival." Elena felt her smile fade as she heard those words. For the Keth were not a species known for their interest in art or music or any of the things that Thessaly Station represented. They were conquerors who had built their empire through strength and violence, and they had never once attended any gathering that did not serve their military interests. "Are you certain this message is genuine?" she asked, and Marcus nodded his head with a troubled expression that matched her own growing concern. "It came through official channels, and they have already dispatched a ship carrying their cultural attach and a small group of observers who wish to learn more about human traditions." Elena considered this news as she looked out at the gardens where flowers from a dozen different worlds bloomed in colors that had no names in any human language. Perhaps the Keth had finally decided to embrace something other than conquest. Or perhaps they were simply curious about the species that had somehow earned the respect of so many civilizations without ever firing a weapon in anger. "We will welcome them as we welcome all who come here in peace," Elena finally said, though something deep in her heart whispered that she should be careful. The Keth delegation arrived 2 days before the festival was set to begin, and Elena met them at the docking bay with the traditional greeting that humanity offered to all visitors. There were 5 of them in total. Tall creatures with skin like polished stone and eyes that reflected light in ways that made them seem almost mechanical. Their leader introduced himself as Commander Veth, and he studied everything around him with an intensity that made Elena feel as though she were being evaluated rather than welcomed. "This station is most impressive," Veth said as they walked through the corridors toward the guest quarters that had been prepared for them. and we have heard many stories about the things your species has collected here. We are happy to share it with anyone who wishes to appreciate what sentient beings can create when they work together." Elena replied, and she noticed that Veth seemed to find her words amusing in some way she could not understand. The days that followed were strange ones for Elena as she watched the Keth delegation move through the station asking questions that no other visitors had ever thought to ask. "Why do you preserve the works of the dead?" Veth asked one afternoon as they stood before a painting that a human artist had created nearly 1,000 years ago. "Because beauty does not die simply because its creator is no longer living," Elena answered. "And because future generations deserve to experience what those who came before them were able to imagine." Veth made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been something else entirely, and he moved on to the next gallery without another word. The festival began on schedule, and Thessaly Station came alive with performances and exhibitions that showcased the finest achievements of 12 different civilizations. Elena stood in the great amphitheater as a human orchestra performed Beethoven's Ninth Symphony for an audience of thousands, and she felt tears forming in her eyes as the music swelled to its triumphant conclusion. She looked across the crowd and saw Commander Veth watching with his stone-like face revealing nothing of what he might be thinking or feeling. When the performance ended and the audience rose to offer their appreciation, Elena noticed that Veth had already left his seat and was speaking quietly into a communication device he had kept hidden beneath his formal robes. Something cold settled in her stomach as she watched him, but she told herself that she was simply being paranoid about visitors who had done nothing wrong. The final night of the festival arrived, and the station was filled with celebration as species who had once been strangers shared food and music and stories with one another. Elena was dancing with a diplomat from the Vendari Consortium when the lights suddenly flickered and a deep rumbling sound shook the station to its very core. Through the great windows she could see them now, dozens of Keth warships that had appeared from nowhere as though they had been hiding in the darkness all along. Commander Veth's voice echoed through every speaker on the station, and his words were ones that Elena would remember for the rest of her life. "We thank you for demonstrating your weakness," he said as the first missile streaked toward the place that humanity had built to celebrate everything beautiful in the universe. The last thing Elena saw before the explosion threw her into unconsciousness was the garden where she had walked just days before, and the flowers from a dozen worlds burning in flames that would consume everything she had ever loved. The message arrived on Earth 3 days after the attack, and it was nothing more than fragments of screaming and static that cut through the silence of space. Like a knife through flesh, Prime Minister David Okonkwo stood in the communication center beneath the old city of Geneva and listened as technicians tried to piece together what had happened to Thessaly Station and the millions of souls who had called it home. "We are receiving scattered distress signals from escape pods," one of the technicians reported, her voice trembling as she worked. "But the main station structure is gone and most of the surrounding area is filled with debris." David closed his eyes and felt the weight of those words settle upon his shoulders like a burden he had never been prepared to carry. 2.3 million people had been on that station when the Keth attacked, and the numbers coming in suggested that fewer than 10,000 had managed to reach the escape pods before everything was destroyed. Among the dead were artists whose paintings had hung in galleries across the galaxy, musicians whose compositions had brought tears to the eyes of beings who had never known what music was, and children who had been brought to the festival to learn that the universe was full of wonder. The Keth broadcast came 12 hours later, and it was transmitted on every frequency known to spacefaring civilizations, so that none could claim they had not heard it. Humanity was a corrupting influence upon the galaxy. The Keth High Commander declared in a voice that held no emotion whatsoever, and their obsession with what they called culture made other species soft and weak. So we have done the galaxy a service by removing this infection before it could spread any further. David watched the broadcast in silence, and when it ended, he turned to face the council members who had gathered around him with expressions of horror and disbelief upon their faces. "What do we do?" asked Minister Chun, who had overseen the cultural exchange programs that had made humanity so beloved among the stars. "We have no military to speak of, and our defense fleet consists of rescue ships and science vessels that were never designed for combat." The council chamber erupted into arguments as some called for immediate surrender, while others demanded that humanity flee to the outer colonies where the theories of the Vuz, or immediate surrender, while others demanded that humanity flee to the outer colonies where the theory to the outer colonies, as some called for immediate surrender, while others demanded that humanity flee to the outer colonies where the Vanachalon. Keth might not follow David listened to them all, but his attention kept returning to the door at the far end of the chamber where a medical team had just appeared with a woman in a wheelchair who looked as though she had walked through the fires of hell itself. Ambassador Elena Vasquez had survived the destruction of Thessaly Station, pulled from the wreckage by a rescue team that had found her floating among the debris of the garden she had loved so much. Her face was covered in burns and her left arm was wrapped in bandages that could not hide the damage that lay beneath them. But her eyes were clear and sharp as she was wheeled to the center of the chamber. "Let her speak," David said, and the arguing council members fell silent as they turned to face the woman who had witnessed the massacre firsthand. Elena's voice was rough and broken when she began to speak, but every word carried a weight that filled the chamber like thunder. "They did not just kill our people," she said, "and they did not just destroy our station. For what they truly did was burn our paintings and silence our music and erase our poetry from the universe, as though none of it had ever existed." She paused to catch her breath, and David could see the tears streaming down her scarred face as she continued. "They did this because they believed that culture made us weak, and they thought that by destroying everything we had created, they would prove that their way of conquest and violence was the only path that mattered." The chamber was completely silent now, and Elena looked around at the faces of the council members who had been arguing about surrender. "Just moments before, I watched children die in that attack," she said, "and I heard their screams as the fire consumed the only home they had ever known. So do not tell me that we should surrender to the creatures who did this, and do not tell me that we should run and hide in the darkness of space." David stepped forward and placed his hand upon Elena's shoulder, and when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the chamber. "The ambassador is right," he said, "and we must now make a decision that will determine the future of our species for generations to come." He turned to face the council, and something had changed in his expression that made even the oldest members feel a chill run down their spines. "The Keth believe that they have destroyed us," David continued, "and they think that by burning our art and killing our artists, they have proven that humanity was nothing more than a weak species that deserved to be eliminated." He walked to the center of the chamber and activated the holographic display that showed the burning remains of Thessaly Station still floating in the void. "But they have made a terrible mistake," he said, "for they have confused our choice to be peaceful with an inability to be anything else. And they have forgotten that the same species that painted the Sistine Chapel also build weapons capable of destroying entire worlds." The council members exchanged glances as David's words sank in, and some of them began to understand what he was suggesting. "We chose peace 300 years ago," David said, And we chose to put away our weapons and become gardeners instead of warriors. But that choice has now been taken from us by creatures who believe that beauty is weakness and that culture is corruption." He paused and looked at Elena, who nodded slowly despite the pain that every movement caused her. "So we will give them what they want," David said, and his voice grew cold in a way that none of them had ever heard before. "For they have declared that they will no longer allow humanity to be cultured. And we will show them exactly what humanity becomes when we are not allowed to create. Deep beneath the surface of Earth, in vaults that had been sealed for 3 centuries, ancient systems began to awaken as authorization codes that had not been used since the last Great War were transmitted. Through secure channels, the galaxy had known humanity as artists and dreamers and keepers of beauty. But they were about to remember what humanity had been before they made the choice to lay down their weapons. And the Keth would learn that some choices, once made, cannot be unmade without consequences that echo through the stars forever. 6 months had passed since the massacre at Thessaly Station, and the galaxy watched in growing unease as humanity began to transform itself into something that none of them had ever expected to see. The vaults beneath Earth's surface had contained more than anyone outside of the highest levels of government had ever known. For humanity had not forgotten how to make war during their 3 centuries of peace. They had simply chosen not to use that knowledge. And now that choice had been ripped away from them by creatures who had mistaken gentleness for weakness. Elena Vasquez stood in the underground facility known only as Archive 7 and watched as engineers and scientists worked around the binge clock to bring ancient systems back to life. Her burns had healed into scars that covered half of her face, and her left arm had been replaced with a prosthetic that was stronger than the one she had been born with. She had volunteered for the newly formed Terran Defense Initiative on the same day that Prime Minister Okonkwo had announced humanity's response to the attack, and she had been assigned to a special project that carried a name that sent chills down the spines of everyone who heard it. Project Realm was dedicated to one simple purpose, and that purpose was to ensure that the Keth would remember every single name of every single person they had killed at Thessaly Station. "The weapon systems from the old wars are impressive," said Dr. Marcus Webb as he walked beside Elena through the facility. "But what we are creating now makes them look like toys designed for children." He was a historian who had spent his career studying the conflicts that humanity had fought before they chose the path of peace. And now he was helping to adapt that knowledge for a new generation of warriors. "We are not simply rebuilding what we once had," Marcus continued, "for we are taking 300 years of cultural and scientific advancement and applying it to the art of war in ways that our ancestors could never have imagined." Elena nodded as they entered a massive chamber where a team of artists was working alongside weapons engineers to design something that the galaxy had never seen before. The artists had once painted murals that celebrated the beauty of nature and the harmony between species. But now they were creating camouflage systems that could bend light itself and make ships invisible to sensors that had been considered foolproof for centuries. In another section of the facility, musicians were working with physicists to develop sonic weapons that were calibrated specifically to Keth neural frequencies. And the sounds they created in their testing chambers were beautiful and terrible. All at once, poets who had once written verses about love and hope were now crafting psychological warfare scripts that would be broadcast to Keth forces during battle. And philosophers who had debated the nature of existence were designing ethical frameworks for what they called proportional annihilation. "We have become something that should not exist," Elena said quietly as she watched a group of former dancers choreographing attack patterns for fighter squadrons. "And I am not certain whether I should feel proud or horrified by what we are creating." Marcus placed his hand on her shoulder and looked at her with eyes that held a sadness she recognized from her own reflection. "We did not choose this," he said. "And the Keth forced us to remember what we spent 3 centuries trying to forget. So if there is horror in what we are becoming, then that horror belongs to them and not to us." The transformation of humanity's fleet was unlike anything the galaxy had witnessed and recorded. History rescue ships that had once rushed to save lives were retrofitted into carriers that could deploy hundreds of fighters at a moment's notice. Science vessels that had explored the mysteries of the universe were converted into destroyers armed with weapons that seemed to defy the laws of physics, themselves and the species that had been known across the stars for their symphony. Orchestras and their beautiful paintings began conducting something else entirely. The first test of humanity's new capabilities came when a Keth scout fleet entered human space, expecting to find easy targets among the outer colonies. There were 12 ships in the fleet, and their commander had been told that the humans would surrender at the first sign of force because they had grown too soft to fight. The scout fleet encountered the TDS Guernica at the edge of the Proxima system, and the ship's name was taken from a painting that depicted the horrors of war in images that had haunted humanity for nearly 1,000 years. Captain Sarah Chun commanded the Guernica, and before the war she had been a cellist who performed with orchestras on 3 different worlds. Now she stood on the bridge of a warship and watched as the Keth fleet approached with weapons charged and confidence radiating from every transmission they sent. "They are demanding our surrender," her communications officer reported, "and they say that resistance will only make our deaths more painful." Sarah smiled, and it was not the kind of smile that brought comfort to those who saw it. "Open a channel," she said, "and broadcast the following message on all frequencies." The Keth fleet heard the transmission that followed, and it was not the pleading surrender they had expected. Instead, it was music. A piece composed by a human named Gustav Mahler centuries ago that built slowly from whispers to thunder as the final notes echoed through the void. The Guernica and its escort ships opened fire with weapons that moved faster than the Keth sensors could track and struck harder than their shields could withstand. The battle lasted less than 4 minutes. And when it ended, there was nothing left of the Keth scout fleet but scattered debris floating in the darkness. One survivor had managed to send a transmission before his ship was destroyed, and his words would be repeated throughout the Keth Dominion in the days that followed. "They're not fighting like we expected," he had screamed as the Guernica bore down upon him. "For they are fighting like they are already dead and have nothing left to lose." Elena listened to that transmission in Archive 7 and felt something stir within her heart that might have been satisfaction or might have been grief. The Keth had wanted humanity to stop being cultured, and now they were beginning to understand what that truly meant. But this was only the beginning, and the symphony of vengeance that humanity was composing had many more movements yet to play. 1 year had passed since the massacre at Thessaly Station, and the war that the Keth had started was now spreading across the galaxy like fire through dry grass. Admiral Chen Wei stood on the bridge of the flagship TDS Prometheus and watched as his fleet moved through the void in patterns that resembled nothing the enemy had ever encountered before. Before the war, he had conducted the Berlin Philharmonic, and he had spent decades learning how to guide hundreds of musicians through compositions that built and fell and rose again in ways that touched the deepest parts of the human soul. Now he guided warships instead of violins, and the compositions he created were written in plasma fire and antimatter explosions that lit up the darkness of space. "The enemy fleet is holding position near the 3rd planet," his tactical officer reported, "and they outnumber us 3-1. Admiral Chun nodded slowly and studied the holographic display that showed the positions of both fleets with perfect clarity. They still believe that numbers are what win battles, he said. And they have not yet learned that humanity fights differently than any species they have ever faced. He turned to his communications officer and spoke the words that had become legendary among the Terran. Defense forces, begin the first movement. The human fleet split into smaller groups that moved with a coordination so precise that it seemed impossible. And each group played a different role in the symphony of destruction that Admiral Chun had composed for this moment. The Kef commander watched his sensors and tried to understand what was happening. As the human ships danced around his fleet like leaves in a storm, he had won dozens of battles against species that were supposed to be stronger than humanity. And he had never encountered tactics that made so little sense to his warrior's mind. Then the music began, and the Kef commander felt something he had not experienced since he was a child learning to fight in the training pits of his homeworld. Fear. The human ships were broadcasting a piece of music that their species called Beethoven's Seventh Symphony, and the sounds filled the communication channels with a power that seemed to shake the very fabric of space itself. The Kef had learned to associate certain human compositions with defeat, and this particular piece had been played during some of the worst losses their forces had suffered. It is just noise, the commander snarled to his crew, and it cannot hurt us if we do not let it affect our minds. But his words rang hollow as the second movement of Admiral Chun's battle plan began to unfold, and ships that had seemed scattered suddenly converged on weak points in the Kef formation with devastating precision. The battle lasted 3 hours, and when it ended, the Kef fleet had been reduced to floating wreckage. While the human forces had lost only a handful of vessels, Admiral Chun ordered his ships to hold position as rescue teams searched the debris for survivors. And the galaxy watched as humans pulled their enemies from the darkness and treated their wounds with the same care they would have shown their own people. We are not monsters, Admiral Chun said when reporters asked why he had bothered to save Kef lives, and we never wanted this war. But we will finish it in a way that proves we have not forgotten who we truly are. Far across the galaxy, Elena Vasquez was leading a ground assault on a Kef world that had been used as a staging area for attacks on human colonies. She commanded a force of soldiers who had been teachers and artists and doctors before. The war had transformed them into something else entirely. Before the battle began, she gathered her troops in the landing zone and asked them to do something that had become a tradition among Project Requiem forces. They recited the names of the dead from Thessaly Station, all 2.3 million of them, and the recitation took 11 hours to complete. The Kef defenders listened on intercepted channels as the humans spoke name after name after name. And as the hours passed, they began to understand something that their leaders had failed to grasp when they ordered the attack on Thessaly. Humanity was not fighting for conquest or resources or territory, for they were fighting because every single person on that station had mattered to them. And they would not stop until the universe understood the weight of what had been lost. When the assault finally began, the Kef forces fought with everything they had. But they were facing enemies who moved with a purpose that went beyond simple victory. Elena led her soldiers through the enemy fortifications like a conductor leading an orchestra through a piece of music that had been practiced 1,000 times. Every movement was precise, and every action had meaning. And by the time the Kef commander offered his surrender, there was nothing left of his defense force but scattered survivors who stared at the humans with something that might have been terror. The galactic community that had refused to help humanity when they begged for assistance after the massacre now watched the war unfold with a mixture of fascination and horror. They are not just winning, one alien ambassador reported to her government after observing a human fleet in action. for they are making a statement that will be remembered for 10,000 years. The Keth High Command gathered in their fortress on their homeworld and discussed something that their species had never considered in all their centuries of conquest. They discussed terms of surrender, but when their message reached Earth, Prime Minister Okonkwo's response was broadcast across the galaxy for all to hear. "You wanted us to stop being cultured," he said, "and you believed that by destroying our art and our music and our children, you could force us to become like you." His voice grew cold as he continued, and the Keth High Command felt the weight of his words settle upon them like the darkness of space itself. "We are giving you exactly what you asked for. And now you will learn that there are some things worse than death. And one of those things is facing an enemy who has nothing left to lose but their memory of everything you took from them." The war continued, and the Keth began to understand that surrender might not be enough to end what they had started. 2 years had passed since the massacre at Thessaly Station, and the Terran fleet now orbited the Keth homeworld like a ring of steel, and fire wrapped around a planet that had never known. Defeat Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of the flagship TDS Ozymandias and looked down at the world where the species that had destroyed everything she loved made their home. The ship's name came from a poem written by a human named Percy Shelley nearly 1,000 years ago, and it told the story of a great king whose empire had crumbled to dust while his proud words remained carved in stone for all to see. She thought about that poem as she watched the Keth cities spread across the continents below, and she wondered if their civilization would suffer the same fate as the ancient king whose monument had been swallowed by the desert. Sans Admiral Chun Wei entered the bridge and stood beside her with an expression that showed the weariness of 2 years of constant warfare. "The High Command has transmitted their unconditional surrender," he said, "and they are asking what terms we will impose upon their species." Elena nodded slowly and felt the weight of that question settle upon her shoulders like a burden she had never wanted to carry. The Terran fleet had the power to destroy every city on the planet below and turn the Keth homeworld into a lifeless rock floating in the void. They had the weapons and the justification and the rage that had built up over 2 years of watching their enemies fall before them. "What do you think we should do?" Admiral Chun asked, and Elena could hear the exhaustion in his voice. That came from fighting a war that should never have been necessary. She thought about the children's choir that had been performing in the main amphitheater when the bombs fell on Thessaly Station, and she remembered the sound of their voices rising in harmony just moments before the explosion silenced them forever. She thought about the painter who had died shielding a Keth visitor from the flames, a young woman who believed so strongly in the power of art to connect different species that she gave her life, trying to protect someone from the very civilization that was killing her. And she thought about the garden where she had walked every morning, where flowers from a dozen worlds had bloomed in colors that had no names in any human language. "I think we should ask Prime Minister Okonkwo," Elena finally said, "because this decision belongs to all of humanity, and not just to those of us who have been fighting." The surrender ceremony took place 3 days later on the surface of the Keth homeworld, in a great plaza that had been built to celebrate their conquests over species that had fallen before their might prime. Minister David Okonkwo traveled from Earth to accept the surrender in person, and the galaxy held its breath as his shuttle descended through the atmosphere of a world that had caused so much suffering. The Keth High Commander waited in the plaza with the other leaders of his species, and they watched as the human delegation approached with expressions that revealed nothing of what they might be. Feeling Elena walked beside the Prime Minister, and the scars on her face served as a reminder to everyone present of what the Keth had done to earn this moment. The High commander stepped forward and spoke the words of surrender that his species had never uttered in all their centuries of existence. "We submit to the judgment of humanity," he said, "and we accept whatever fate you choose to impose upon our civilization." The plaza fell silent as everyone waited for the Prime Minister to respond, and Elena could feel the tension in the air like electricity before a storm. David Okonkwo looked at the Keth leaders who stood before him, creatures who had ordered the deaths of millions and the destruction of everything that humanity had built among the stars. Then, he reached into his coat and pulled out something that made the Keth step back in confusion. It was a small oil painting in a simple wooden frame, and it showed a garden filled with flowers that seemed to glow with an inner light. "This was recovered from the wreckage of Thessaly Station," David said, "and it was painted by a 12-year-old girl named Maya Chun, who died when your ships opened fire." He held the painting up so that everyone in the plaza could see it, and the colors seemed even more beautiful against the gray stone of the Keth architecture. "Maya wanted to be an artist when she grew up," David continued, "and she spent weeks working on this painting so she could show it at the Festival of Civilizations." His voice grew quiet, but his words carried across the plaza with a clarity that made every soul present feel their weight. "You took her from us," he said, "and you took 2.3 million others who had dreams and hopes and people who loved them. And you did this because you believed that our love of beauty made us weak." He lowered the painting and looked directly into the eyes of the High Commander. "We could destroy you now," David said, "and we could erase your species the way you tried to erase our culture. For we have the power and the justification, and every right that victory gives to those who have been wronged." The Keth leaders waited for the sentence of death that they believed was coming, and some of them closed their eyes so they would not have to see the face of their executioner. But the words that followed were not what any of them expected to hear. "Being cultured was never our weakness," David said, "for it was always our choice, and choosing mercy now, choosing to rebuild instead of destroy, and create instead of annihilate. That is also a choice, a human choice." He held out the painting to the High Commander, who took it with hands that trembled despite his efforts to hide his confusion. "We are going to rebuild Thessaly Station," David said, "and when it is finished your children will be welcome there, so they can learn what you never did about the true meaning of strength." The terms of surrender were announced to the galaxy, and they were unlike anything that history had ever recorded. The Keth Dominion was dissolved, and their worlds became protectorates under galactic law. They were forbidden from maintaining offensive military forces for 100 years, and they were required to contribute to the rebuilding of everything they had destroyed. But they were not exterminated, and they were not enslaved, and they were given something that was far more terrifying to a warrior culture than death itself. They were given the opportunity to learn 50 years past, and the new Thessaly Station orbited the same world where the original had been. Destroyed Elena Vasquez sat in the main amphitheater as an old woman whose scars had faded to thin white lines across her weathered face. The memorial wall behind her held 2.3 million names carved into stone that would last as long as the stars themselves on the stage. Before her, a group of young musicians was preparing to perform, and among them was a Keth woman who held a violin with the same care that a mother might hold a newborn child. She was part of the first Keth orchestra ever formed, and they were about to perform Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in honor of those who had died, so that this moment could exist. Music began with soft strings that built slowly towards something greater, and Elena felt the tears forming in her eyes as she listened to sounds that she had thought were lost forever. The Keth woman played her violin with a skill that would have amazed the masters who had first created the instrument, and her eyes were closed as she let the music flow through her like water through a river. When the final movement arrived and the choir began to sing the Ode to Joy, Elena whispered words that only she could hear. "This is what it means to be cultured," she said. "Not just the creation of beauty, but the choice to create beauty, even after everything has been taken from you." The music swelled to its triumphant conclusion, and the audience rose to their feet in appreciation that crossed the boundaries between species. On the stage, the Keth violinist opened her eyes and looked out at the crowd. And for a moment her gaze met Elena's across the distance that separated them. In that moment, two former enemies shared something that had no words. A understanding that what had been broken could be rebuilt, and what had been lost could be remembered, and what had seemed impossible could become real if only someone was brave enough to choose it. The galaxy had learned that humanity could be terrifying when they were forced to fight. But they had also learned something far more important. They had learned that humanity's greatest strength had never been their ability to destroy, for it had always been their ability to create and to keep creating, and to never stop believing that beauty was worth fighting for if music ended. And the silence that followed was not empty but full of memories and hope, and the promise that the universe was big enough for all who wished to fill it with wonder. And somewhere in that silence, Maya Chun's painting hung in a place of honor, its flowers still glowing with the light that a 12-year-old girl had imagined when she dreamed of showing the galaxy what humanity could create.